Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you again this morning, and thank you very much indeed, Alan, for those kind words. It's perfectly true that my book got to number 2 in the bestseller list, beaten only by a book about Michael Jackson. What a fantastic conference we have had, a series of serious and substantial scholars telling you genuine quotations and true facts about Winston Churchill. And we've also had Boris Johnson. I think Boris's attitude towards facts is very much what one would call à la carte. And his speech reminded me very much of a friend of mine on Radio 4 who said that the trouble with Winston Churchill is he thinks he's Boris Johnson. I'd also, although this has absolutely nothing to do with my speech, like to have a 2-minute rant, if that's all right, about the recent BBC programme thank you, you hated it as well, madam, quite right too. It really was, it was on last Saturday, and it really was outrageous that the BBC can make statements such as the working classes hated Churchill. Winston Churchill could not have won the 1951 general election without at least 40% of the working classes voting for him. For the BBC to say that he didn't understand grand strategy. This is the man who, I think it was pointed out earlier in this conference, before Brooke himself came up with a grand strategy that eventually won the war for the Western Allies. And for the BBC also to say that Winston Churchill didn't oppose appeasement enough, when it was the BBC that had kept Winston Churchill off the airwaves for so long during the wilderness years, shows the intense hypocrisy of that organisation when it comes to Winston Churchill. Thank you. Rant over. I believe the greatest man of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, was profoundly influenced by the greatest man of the 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte. Indeed, insofar as Winston Churchill had role models in life, they were his father, Lord Randolph, and Napoleon Bonaparte. It was Winston Churchill who noted that his parents met at Cowes on the Isle of Wight on the 15th of August, 1873, which was Napoleon's 104th birthday. Churchill admired the way that Napoleon started his successful military career early in life, despite, or more probably because of, the fact that Napoleon's father had died when he was just 15, not much younger than Churchill was when his father died. When, in 1950, he summoned the cephalogist Dr. David Butler of Princeton to brief him on the forthcoming election, Churchill was somewhat taken aback to discover that Butler was a mere 25 years old. "Better hurry up, young man," he teased him. Napoleon was only 26 when he crossed the bridge of Lodi. "I was quite in awe," recorded Butler. "I wasn't a Conservative supporter, but I knew I was in the presence of the greatest man in the world." Churchill learnt from Napoleon that there's nothing wrong with youthful ambition, so long as it's allied with extraordinary talent. And of course, needless to say, it certainly was in both their cases. Neither Napoleon nor Churchill were born French, but they were both Francophiles who believed in military glory, and each had an unshakable belief in his own star. They both had occasional shattering reversals of fortune. We, of course, yesterday heard about the Dardanelles, and Napoleon's life is full of them as well. But they did nothing to dim that self-belief. Churchill didn't at all subscribe to the traditional British view of Napoleon, which I'm sorry to say is still the traditional view of him, as you'll notice if you read any of the reviews of my book, that he was an evil monster, rather than just a foreign tyrant who wished to invade Britain. It doubtless helped that, with regard to Churchill's admiration, that Napoleon admired the first Duke of Marlborough, so much, in fact, that he erected a bust of him at the Tuileries Palace when he was first consul, the only Englishman besides Cromwell to be so honoured. Although Churchill started collecting books on Napoleon from 1909 onwards, which was finally to constitute a library of 170 well-read volumes, many of which he had bound and which can be seen today in the Churchill archives, his first written reference to the emperor appears in his longest poem, written at Harrow in 1819 when he was 16. An Ode to Influenza, it's called. And the fourth of the 12 stanzas goes, Of Moscow's fair and famous town, where fell the first Napoleon's crown, it made a direful swoop. The rich, the poor, the high, the low, alike the various symptoms know, alike before it droop. Thereafter, Napoleon references come thick and fast, and together they show that Churchill not only had read widely and deeply in the Napoleonic canon, but had thought carefully about the lessons of Napoleon's life and the context that it could give to the contemporary politics in which he had every intention of playing a leading part. In June 1909, on the face of it somewhat unlikely occasion of a temperance meeting in Manchester Free Trade Hall discussing the licensing bill, Churchill urged his listeners to, quote, remember that the great Napoleon said, always be strongest at the point of attack. Choose your point of attack, single it out, concentrate all your energies in it, and make your attack absolutely overwhelming and effective. Churchill's own strategy, both political and military, could hardly be better summarised. A year later, again speaking this time actually on the Boer War, in the House of Commons, Churchill said, unless a nation was so fortunate as to possess a very great general, like Napoleon or the Duke of Wellington or the Duke of Marlborough, it must win its wars either by the superior quality or quantity of the troops employed. It was a clever linking of his hero Napoleon's name with that of his other great hero, his great ancestor Marlborough. At a constituency meeting in Dundee in September 1912, Churchill said, we have studied the interests of the millions. We have marched, like Napoleon, with the opinions of millions of men. We have faith in our work, and we are proud of it. And the following year, at Alexandra Palace, he added, the great Napoleon, he often called him the great Napoleon, described us as a nation of shopkeepers. If that be true, it is astonishing that we have not managed to make our legislation a little fairer to shopkeepers. In making the British case for war within a month of its breaking out in August 1914, Churchill argued in the Commons that it is the old struggle of 100 years ago against Napoleon. The grouping of the forces is different, the circumstances are different, the occasion is different, the man above all is different, happily. But the issue is the same. We are at grips with militarism. England stands in the path of this overgrowing power. Of course, the Napoleon reference was used against Churchill almost as much as by him. In July 1803, Napoleon referred to Antwerp as a pistol pointed at Great Britain. And when in October 1914, Churchill embarked on the brave, controversial, but ultimately doomed attempt to keep the city out of German hands for as long as possible, the Morning Post wrote of Churchill, this severe lesson ought to teach him that he is not a Napoleon, but a minister of the crown with no time either to organise or to lead armies in the field. In the interwar years, the cartoonist David Lowe occasionally portrayed Churchill as a would-be Napoleon, intended to be to Churchill's detriment. A month after the Antwerp debacle, Churchill summed up the ghosts of the British heroes of the Napoleonic Wars in the Lord Mayor's banquet at the Guildhall. We see the monuments of the men who fought against Napoleon, he said. We may feel tonight almost as if we have their counsel and their aid, and we may derive inspiration and encouragement from their memory. Churchill's Napoleon obsession, but which I don't mean in a pejorative sense because I myself suffer from it very seriously, raised its head in the Gallipoli campaign as well. On the 8th of April, 1915, Churchill wrote to the First Sea Lord, Jackie Fisher, criticising Fisher's plans to delay or even cancel the Dardanelles operation. In it, Churchill quoted Napoleon's remark, "We are defeated at sea because our admirals have learnt, where I know not, that war can be made without running risks." Criticising the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Snowden, in a debate on unemployment in March 1930, Churchill said, "We all know how Napoleon, before the Battle of Leipzig, said, 'Do you think that I'm a man who cares a snap of the fingers for the lives of 100,000 soldiers?'" It's very likely, by the way, that Metternich made up that quote and that Napoleon never said it. But those are the days, aren't they, when, of course, people did know such things and that children were actually taught history properly in their schools. You will, I'm sure, all know and be equally as shocked as I am about the recent survey of school children, 16 to 18-year-olds, who some 34% of whom believed that the American War of Independence was won by Denzel Washington. And there's another one quite recently, which actually, I think it was 1/5 of school children who believed that Winston Churchill was a fictional character, yes, alongside Eleanor Rigby and Sherlock Holmes. 2 months after that attack on Philip Snowden, Churchill attacked him again in the finance bill, saying, "There are £40 million to be swept away before we get to any constructive social programme, even if a surplus were in view. Napoleon said to his soldiers, 'From the top of these pyramids, 40 centuries are looking down on you.' The Chancellor of the Exchequer says to the Clyde, 'From the trough of the Treasury, £40 million are gaping up at you.'" Violet Bonham Carter believed Churchill and Napoleon shared a belief in advancing their families, and tells the charming story in her book, Winston Churchill as I Knew Him, of how I often told him that one quality he shared with his great hero, Napoleon, was nepotism. That if he had been Napoleon, he would have popped all the guests, the family called guests, his cousins, his brother Jack and Sonny Marlborough on every throne in Europe, and made his mother Empress of Byzantium. He didn't deny it and suggested it might have been quite a good thing to do. I think Sonny would have done very well in Spain, and Jack might have made one of the Scandinavian countries. And then Violet Bonham Carter goes on to say he smiled as he distributed these crowns, but it was clear that the prospect appealed to him. In January 1932, during the wilderness years in which he kept a bust of Napoleon on his desk at Chartwell, he told an author, Robert Ballon, that he would only write a 5,000-word introduction to Ballon's biography of Napoleon on condition that he kept the copyright, as he might one day write a book on the subject, something he tragically never got around to doing. 2 years later, he told Clemmy, "I really must try to write a Napoleon before I die, but the work piles up ahead, and I wonder whether I shall ever have the time and strength." Churchill drafted Napoleon into combat in the struggle against appeasement, of course. In his great speech about the German air menace on the 29th of November 1934, he said, another of his speeches that was not broadcast by the BBC, needless to say, he said, "Beware. Germany is a country fertile in military surprises. The great Napoleon, in the years after Jena, was completely taken by surprise by the strength of the German army which fought the War of Liberation. Although he had officers all over Germany, the strength of the army which fought him in the Leipzig campaign was 3 or 4 times as strong as he expected." In March 1936, just as he had before the First World War, he said, "For 400 years, the foreign policy of England has been to oppose the strongest, most aggressive, most dominating power on the continent, and particularly to prevent the Low Countries falling into the hands of such a power. Viewed in the light of history, these 4 centuries of consistent purpose, amid so many changes of names and facts, of circumstances and conditions, must rank as one of the most remarkable episodes which the records of any race, nation, state, or people can show. Moreover, on all occasions, England took the most difficult course, faced by Philip II of Spain, against Louis XIV under William III and Marlborough, against Napoleon, against Wilhelm II of Germany. It would have been easy and must have been very tempting to join with the stronger and share the fruits of his conquest. However, we always took the harder course, joined with the less strong powers, made a combination against them, and thus defeated and frustrated the continental military tyrant, whoever he was, whatever nation he led." Lest anyone misapprehend and think Churchill did not admire Napoleon, the following month in the Daily Mail, he described the emperor as a military tyrant, a conqueror, a man of order and discipline, a man of overwhelming egotism, but his grandeur defied misfortune and rises superior even to time. 2 months later, speaking about the hapless Sir Thomas Inskip, who had the Ministry of Defence coordination job that of course should have been given to Churchill, Churchill said, "He has allowed himself to become the innocent victim of responsibilities so strangely, so inharmoniously, so perversely grouped, endowed with powers so cribbed and restricted that no one, not even Napoleon himself, would be able to discharge them with satisfaction." So much an admirer of Napoleon was Churchill, and also of Lawrence of Arabia, that in his eulogy on T.E. Lawrence in October 1936, he went so far as to say, Lawrence might have realized Napoleon's young dream of conquering the East. He might have arrived at Constantinople in 1919 or 1920 with most of the tribes and races of Asia Minor and Arabia at his back. The coming of the Second World War saw Churchill making his famous "Do not yield another yard" speech of the 3rd of April 1939, in which he said, "We read how, when Napoleon's army lay at Boulogne 140 years ago, the threat of invasion hung over this country from day to day. Dependent upon the shift of the wind, our ancestors showed qualities of doggedness and phlegm deemed remarkable by all who observed it. But that is nothing to the ordeal which the British nation is today facing with complete composure. Nothing with which Napoleon threatened England is half as intimate or direct as the destruction and ordeal which would fall upon this country should we be involved in a modern war." It was, of course, a theme to which he was to return during some of his greatest wartime speeches, with the implicit message that Britain had been there before and triumphed, and thus could do so again. Churchill had, therefore, the difficult job of both admiring the great Napoleon, but also using him as a model enemy for earlier bravery against the threat of invasion. Nor could he be too rude about Napoleon, even if he wanted to be, because the French were our allies. In a debate on Norway on the 11th, the Norway campaign on the 11th of April 1940, he once again used Napoleon for an historical analogy, telling the Commons, "For myself, I consider that Hitler's action in invading Scandinavia is as great a strategic and political error as that committed by Napoleon in 1907 when he invaded Spain." Napoleon was twice mentioned in the great 4th of June 1940 speech in which Churchill told the British people of the story of the evacuation from Dunkirk, which of course began 75 years ago yesterday. When Napoleon lay at Boulogne for a year with his flat-bottomed boats and his Grande Armée, Churchill said, he was told by someone, "There are bitter weeds in England. There are certainly a great many more of them since the British Expeditionary Force returned." Later in that same speech, he said, "In the days of Napoleon, the same wind which would have carried his transports across the Channel might have driven away the blockading fleet. There was always the chance, and it is that chance which has excited and befooled the imaginations of many continental tyrants." During the Battle of Britain, on the 5th of September 1940, Churchill took the opportunity to differentiate between Hitler and Napoleon's empires, saying in a broadcast, "No one can say how far Herr Hitler's empire will extend before this war is over, but I have no doubt that it will pass away as swiftly as, and perhaps more swiftly than, did Napoleon's empire, although, of course, without any of its glitter or its glory." In fact, Hitler's empire lasted 12 years against Napoleon's 16, from 1799 to 1815. But it covered slightly more of Europe than Napoleon's, though, of course, unlike Napoleon, Hitler never captured Cairo, Madrid, or Moscow. On the 21st of October 1940, Churchill broadcast to the French people, a curious choice of date since it was Trafalgar Day, telling them, "Frenchmen, rearm your spirits before it's too late. Remember how Napoleon said before one of his battles, these same Prussians who are so boastful today were 3-1 at Jena and 6-1 at Montmirail." Yet, just as Churchill didn't mention that he was broadcasting on Trafalgar Day, he also sensibly didn't mention that Napoleon had said those words just before the Battle of Waterloo. Churchill's references to Napoleon weren't all confined to public pronouncements. Please see the Times of February the 4th. He wrote to his War Minister, David Margeson, in 1941, "Is it really true that a 7-mile cross-country run is enforced upon all in this division, from generals to privates? Does the Army Council think this is a good idea? It looks to me rather excessive. A colonel or a general ought not to exhaust himself in trying to compete with young boys running across country 7 miles at a time. The duty of officers is no doubt to keep themselves fit, but still more to think of their men and to take decisions affecting their safety or comfort. Who's the general of this division, and does he run the 7 miles himself? If so, he may be more useful for football than for war. Could Napoleon have run 7 miles across country at Austerlitz? Perhaps it was the other fellow he made run. Some have compared Hitler's conquests with those of Napoleon, Churchill said in the Commons on the 7th of May 1941. It may be that Spain and Russia will shortly furnish new chapters to that theme. It must be remembered, however, that Napoleon's armies carried with them the fierce, liberating, and egalitarian winds of the French Revolution, whereas Hitler's empire had nothing behind it but racial self-assertion, espionage, pillage, corruption, and the Russian boot. Yet Napoleon's empire, with all its faults and all its glories, fell and flashed away like snow at Easter, till nothing remained but His Majesty's ship, Bellerophon, which awaited its suppliant refugee. Overall, however, as Churchill put it in September 1944, I always hate to compare Napoleon with Hitler, as it seems an insult to the great emperor and warrior to connect him in any way with a squalid Caucasus boss and butcher. When Churchill visited Paris in November 1944, he took part in the armistice celebrations and he used the opportunity to visit Les Invalides. And on the 12th of November, he told the Paris Liberation Committee at a reception at the Hôtel de Ville that if there had been an opportunity of fighting on equal terms, the French army would have shown and was going to show qualities which made its fame imperishable in the pages of history under the leadership of great men of the past, Clemenceau, Foch, and Napoleon, by whose tomb I stood yesterday. Once again, he diplomatically didn't explain to the French why their army in May 1940, which was stronger in numbers of planes, tanks, and men, hadn't had the opportunity to fight on equal terms with the Germans. After the war was over, Churchill paid further compliments to Napoleon, describing him in A History of the English-Speaking Peoples as the greatest man of action born in Europe since Julius Caesar, adding that the impetus of the French Revolution has been spread by the genius of Napoleon to the far quarters of Europe. Ideals of liberty and nationalism, born in Paris, had been imparted to all the European peoples. In the 19th century ahead, they were to clash resoundingly with the ordered world for which the Congress of Vienna had striven. If France was defeated and her emperor fallen, the principles which had inspired her lived on. They were to play a notable part in changing the shape of government in every European country, Britain not excepted. Alan Packwood, in his brilliant essay on Churchill and Napoleon of 2011, pointed out how, quote, as an historian, Churchill stood in the British liberal Whig tradition. The Whigs had originally welcomed the French Revolution and now hailed Napoleon as the modernizing force that had swept away old tyrannies and established a new Europe based more on law and liberty. The French emperor was celebrated by the Romantic poets and immortalized in the hagiographic biographies that form a large part of Churchill's own collection. Churchill, therefore, enthusiastically embraced the Byronic stance towards Napoleon, and also that of Hazlitt and Goethe and Hegel and Beethoven, at least up until the end of the consulate period, and it was a noble tradition. The similarity of British military strategy in the Second World War to that of the Napoleonic Wars has been written about extensively, from Basil Little-Hart to Michael Howard and many others, and it's too obvious to go into here. Beyond to say that Churchill clearly learnt from Pitt and Nelson and Wellington's successes as much as Hitler failed to learn from Napoleon's great blunder of 1812. By pressing Napoleon into service against Hitler before and during the Second World War, in giving the British Empire a template to work from and an example to follow in the Napoleonic Wars, Churchill made good all his reading about the emperor. Above all, however, Napoleon reminded Churchill that one man can indeed change history, can inspire millions, and make all the difference. For, ladies and gentlemen, never has the great man view of history been more clearly enunciated than in the careers of Winston Churchill and his ultimate role model, Napoleon Bonaparte. Thank you very much.
Hardly present myself as an impartial chair here. But
the sole reason I hasten to add
if it wasn't me sitting here, if it had been Lloyd George sitting here, of course, what he would have said is what he said of Churchill, that you've spoiled yourself by reading too much about Napoleon. Let's see if anyone agrees. Let's see if people would agree with Lloyd George. I suspect not, but questions from the floor. Have we got a question? Over here.
Stephen Bungay here.
Thank you, Andrew. That was fascinating. One might, without knowing what you've just told us, have expected Churchill to seek to emulate, obviously, the Duke of Marlborough, but then perhaps Wolfe, who hailed from Westerham, down the road from Chartwell, and Wellington. Clearly, however, it was Napoleon that captured his imagination and was the role model. And given your deep knowledge of all three characters, could you tell us a little bit more about why you think it was Napoleon rather than Wellington who became the role model for Churchill?
I think the obvious answer would be that Wellington was a failure as a politician. He, in each of the issues that he embraced, both as Prime Minister and before, and indeed afterwards, the opposition to Catholic emancipation, the opposition to the extension of the franchise, and the opposition to the repeal of the Corn Laws, at least at the beginning, Wellington was proved wrong by the experience of history, and that obviously is not something that any statesman is going to want to try to emulate. Also, of course, he was Prime Minister for 2 years, whereas Napoleon was master of Europe for half a generation, and that's going to be more attractive to a man like Winston Churchill.
Okay, one last question. Do we have another question? Okay, so there's one over here. We'll go over here.
Curious on your thoughts on the fact that Napoleon stood for so many things that Churchill did not stand for: conquest, dictatorship, so forth and so on. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yes. Napoleon didn't believe that all of the wars of the Napoleonic Wars, which started, of course, in the Revolutionary French Wars in 1792, when Napoleon was only 24 years old, could be blamed on Napoleon. There were 7 wars of coalition, and all but 2 of them were actually started by the Allies against Napoleon rather than by Napoleon. Of course, the 2 disastrous ones that Napoleon did start, the attack on Spain that Churchill mentioned. By the way, he mentioned it happened in 1807. In fact, it was 1808, but nonetheless. And the other one was, of course, the invasion of Russia. Those 2 were opportunistic and ultimately suicidal mistakes made by Napoleon. But one can't blame the whole of the Napoleonic Wars, these wars of conquest of which you speak, as on this single warmonger, owing to the fact that the Austrians and Prussians and indeed the British, who of course were at war with him for longer than anybody else at all, in fact almost as much as all the rest of them put together, were also entirely committed to this struggle. So I don't think Churchill did see Napoleon he thought of him as a ruthless man. He called him a tyrant, which involves the dictatorship thing that you mentioned, but he didn't think of him as the kind of modern tyrant. Indeed, he wasn't the kind of modern tyrant along the lines of Hitler or Stalin or Mao, who wanted to insert his own ideology into everybody's daily lives. He didn't want to impose into the hearts of men in the same way that the Stalin model and the modern 20th century dictatorship model did. So he thought of Napoleon as a follow-on from Louis XIV, rather than as the beginning of the modern dictatorial model. And also, just to sum up, and I noticed that I've managed to catch up all of the time that you've lost there, Alan. But the other point, of course, that needs to be remembered is that at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and this might be another reason that Churchill admired this whole period and was so fascinated by this period and read about it and spoke about it so often. It was at the Congress of Vienna that ended those wars 200 years ago next month that the British managed to get, although it had absolutely no territorial ambitions in continental Europe, it did manage to get those nodal points around the world, like Trinidad and Heligoland and Zanzibar and Cape Colony and various places out in Asia, which were the key nodal points for the creation of the British Empire that Winston Churchill so admired. So, ladies and gentlemen, I can end on a happy note. Thank you very much indeed.